Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Between Podcast. This is your host, Matt Mattson, and I'm just so deeply grateful that you're listening. Welcome inside another one of our little sacred conversations. I'm just really honored to have you here, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest. Kristen Lavalley is the author of a new book that I couldn't resist this book's beautiful cover when I saw it on my local bookstore shelf, and it did not disappoint. Kristen released the book, Even If He Doesn't, earlier this year, I think, or very recently. And it is this sweet, intimate, vulnerable, and comforting book for anyone who has ever questioned their faith in the midst of suffering. It's a book that offers immediate and gentle relief for anyone who has been taught a formulaic way of believing and then had the math not add up when something real and difficult struck their lives. There are so many people, I think, who are holding on to traumatic moments in their lives with white knuckles and pretend smiles. I've been there. This book is for them. There are so many people who have prayed to God, who have begged God to show up in a specific way to save them from suffering. And God hasn't really delivered on those prayers, and they're left with layers and layers of scars and hurt. This is a book, and Kristen Lavalley is a voice for people who wonder if God is out there, even when he doesn't answer our prayers. Kristen lives in Massachusetts with her husband, Zach, and their five children. And I'm really lucky to get to interview her here on the Between podcast. Welcome, Kristen. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We were commenting before we started recording that yeah, I can see in video. We don't post the video publicly, but I can see in video that I'm on like your front porch on a
Yeah.
beautiful Massachusetts afternoon here, and that's where you're recording from. I like that. I like this setup.
Yeah, it's great. Good vibes.
Kristen, the story you share in this book, even when he doesn't, has several layers, and
Mhm.
I don't know. It's hard to recap, I'm sure. I
Mhm.
started to write a recap and realized I was trying to rewrite the book. And so I decided to just quit and hand this question to you. But I think for somebody listening, the title is compelling enough in itself, but is there
Mhm.
a way you could walk us through some of the layers that you outline in your book? And I think that your voice conveys through your social media presence and the work that you do. Can you somehow try to recap this a little bit for us?
Yeah, I can do that. To contextualize the story a little bit, I am a pastor's kid and I come from a big ministerial family, all in the same denomination. Every adult in my life growing up was either a pastor or a missionary or a worship leader. Like it was just kind of my world. So the church was my world. I went to Bible college. I met my husband at Bible college. We became youth pastors and worship pastors and associate pastors. And we just kind of did everything that was all that we knew. And we did that a little over 10 years. And then we had a really painful church thing that happened, a spiritual trauma, relational trauma that kind of sent us spiraling. We had only been career ministry, and that kind of pushed us to say that we didn't want to do that as a career anymore. And it really, me more than my husband, challenged my faith because my faith had been so tied up in the structure of church and what I thought my formula of faith was, which was if I was good, if I didn't sin that much, if I addressed conflict the right way, if I did everything that I was supposed to do, there were certain guarantees for me. God would
Yeah.
protect me, God would bless me, God would vindicate me. And I held on to those until my fingers broke. And then none of those things happened. And we lost. We had to leave our job. We had to leave our church. We had to leave our house because we lived in the house that the church had built for us. We lost everything. And that caused my faith to really go through this crisis of I think God is real. I'm not sure that he's good. I'm not sure that he is any of the things that I believed him to be. And so I really just dug into that and I got really honest with God. I didn't care if I lost my faith. I got to this point where I was like, I don't even care what happens after this. I just have to get past whatever this is and find some answers. So I spent a few years in that kind of wilderness, just trying to figure out what I believed
Mhm.
anymore. And then after I sort of came out of that, we went through another series, a few more traumas. I saw someone get murdered in my backyard when I was home alone with my kids. It was a gang related thing. So we had to move again. And then we lost a baby. And then we went through this really traumatic crisis twin pregnancy about 2 years, not even 2 years after we lost the baby, where one of the babies, they shared a placenta. So they were identical twins who shared a placenta. And at my 20-week, 19-week ultrasound, the doctor told me that one of the babies was not viable and that she would die. And I needed to choose what I was going to do because of their shared placenta. Her death would probably cause the death of the other baby or cause some long-term developmental. She'd probably have a seizure. She'd never live a normal life. So it was this tension of, am I going to make the choice that's the guarantee, which would be to abort the baby that was not viable to save the life of the other baby? Am I going to do nothing and hope for the best? Am I going to try to find a surgery or something that could help? So it was this really long process of waking up every day and not knowing what the end of the day was going to bring. And at the time, we were living in an RV. We had been traveling in an RV for a year. So that was kind of a whole thing as well. And then at around 29 weeks, I went into labor. I had been in the hospital for 2 weeks, just kind of observing everything that was going on in my body and in the girls' bodies. And they were born on 29 weeks, spent about 3 months in the NICU, and they both ended up surviving and they're doing really well. But that was a really challenging, seems like such a trite word for what that was, because it was the valley of the shadow of death and it was really heavy and really dark. And most people who have all the factors that we had in the girls' bodies and in my bodies, there was a few complicated medical things going on. Their story doesn't end up the way that ours did. And I still don't understand how it happened that we were able to walk away from that together, but I'm really grateful that we did.
Yeah. Kristen, I'm struck sometimes doing this podcast. I've gotten to interview a lot of really cool people with a lot of really cool and complicated stories. And I'm struck by how, I mean, there's part of putting out a book that is promoting it and saying yes to
Hmm.
podcast invitations and posting on
Yeah.
social media all the time and saying over and over, read my book, read the story, read the story.
Hmm.
Uh, do you, I don't know how to ask this, except do you regret sometimes, is there ever moments where you regret like writing a book because you just don't want to tell that story anymore because it's so hard, it's powerful to share and you know it's a gift to the
Yeah.
world, I'm sure, but gosh, every time you have to recount that
Hmm.
story, you're recounting these many, these are not challenges in your life. These are deep traumas that left
Yeah.
real scars and maybe open wounds. I just want to acknowledge that for a second and maybe ask
Yeah.
if that's a feeling that you have.
Yeah, sometimes I do. Not so much that I regret writing the book, but maybe I regret agreeing to as many conversations about it as I
Yeah.
have. I wasn't as carefully, I didn't curate the conversations as carefully as I should have. So there
Mm,
have been some where people were not as tender as you were being,
mm,
which was very emotionally exhausting. But I think when you decide to write a book like this or to share your story in any way, you kind of have to understand that at some point it stops being your story and it becomes our story, and
mm,
you're sharing it with people and they become connected to it and they feel like they're a part of the story because they see themselves in it.
mm.
And I've been writing long enough to know that that was going to be something that I would wrestle with and something that would be really hard to do. So I kind of went into the book knowing this is going to be hard to talk about, and it's going to be hard to take something that is so sacred and so personal and write it in a way that other people will appreciate it and honor it in that way. It's the casting pearls before swine. That there's going to be some swine that are picking up your pearls,
Yeah.
and you have to understand that when you go into it. So I went into the book knowing that not everything was going to be great about sharing this with the world, but having that kind of pre understanding of what that could be like helped me to write the book in a way that would be safe for me to talk about, safe for me to or to just like feel comfortable putting that in the world when it
Yeah.
involves my daughters who are not old enough or mature enough to tell their story yet. I had to really think about how much I'm going to be putting into this book and how much am I willing to share of their story. So it's very complex. But something that I thought was going to be worth it for what I feel like God has me doing in the world right now. I felt like this story was something that needed to be told in the way that only I could tell it.
Yeah. Will you, is it okay if I ask, tell me about your family today? Tell me about what your
Yeah,
daily life is like today. I'm just,
sure.
I only know, I really, I know what I see on your website, what I see on your social media,
Mhm.
and you're really, uh, generously open on social media and like so that's a really beautiful thing to be, and I think a really hard thing to be. We
Thank
could
you.
really just talk about that too, but
Yeah.
sometimes I'm like, yeah, but you know what, you live in a real house and you've got real things going on, and it's probably loud and messy and hard
Yes, it
sometimes. And
is.
anyway, I'm curious about your
Yeah.
family.
Well, we have 5 kids and we homeschool all of them. Our oldest is 13. The youngest, of course, are 2, almost 3 now.
Yeah,
We have 2 boys and 3 girls,
yeah,
and we both work from home. My husband works for a nonprofit, so we kind of tag team here in the porch office. We go
yeah,
back and forth, block our hours a little bit. But our lives are chaos, and yeah, they're chaos. The girls now are going through some developmental challenges that make things just, they're born 3 months early, so they have all kinds
yeah.
of, life is just going to be a little bit harder for them for a little while. So that kind of turns our lives upside down every couple of months. But yeah, we're just busy working, homeschooling, living, currently trying to get out of the longest winter ever
Hmm.
in Massachusetts. But
Hmm.
we love it. We love our lives. We've changed our lifestyle a few times over the years, going from being in full-time ministry to the kind of life that we have now. But it's beautiful and it's fun, and
And
I feel
living in
like
an
one day,
RV, you lived in an
yeah,
RV for a while. I mean, talk
yeah,
about some lifestyle
that's like a
changes.
that's
Yeah.
like a blip now. I'm like that that's such a blur. But I we always say one day we're gonna wake up and we're gonna be 60 years old and we're gonna go, what the heck just happened?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
But it's
Yeah.
great. It's fun.
Yeah. This episode probably doesn't come out until the summer, but I'm dealing with it. We're recording late March. I've got
Mhm.
6 to 7 inches of snow outside my door here in
Oh my
Colorado.
goodness.
And I was in the
Wow.
Northeast. I was in New York last week, and it
Oh
was
wow.
horribly cold all week. And it was,
Oh,
it was actually nice here, but while I was there, it was, in the 30s
ah,
and 40s and freezing. But yeah,
stinks.
yeah. So you mentioned, maybe you've been in some other podcast conversations or other media
Mhm.
conversations that haven't been quite as gentle as I'm trying to be, and I really do want to be respectful of, like, there
Yeah.
are you are talking about trauma for a reason, because a lot of people
Mhm.
have it and a lot of people
Yep.
don't know how to deal with it, especially within the context of faith. But you're
Mhm.
still talking about trauma, and specifically, with the complicated pregnancy, the complicated
Mhm.
birth story of twins, and the um, un like unimaginable choice that
Yeah.
showed up in your face one day of, hey,
Yeah.
you've got to make a decision today. You've never thought about this before, but you got to make a decision today about uh, how to
Yeah.
do you keep both kids, do you like this? And I'm
Yeah.
sure people have spun that story to be about any number of things, but it's pretty easy to make it about
Sure.
abortion law or about
Yeah.
pro-choice, pro-life. How have how have you cut through the noise and
Mhm.
tried to just remember what, maybe even while you were making those decisions, but even
Mhm.
now, well after, and processing through other people's conversations,
Mhm.
how do you stay focused on what was really important to you and what is really important to you, and how you made those decisions and how you keep making decisions?
In the moment, in those doctor's offices where I had to make that choice, I had to make it sometimes 3 times a week
Yeah,
because of how complicated the roller coaster of things. In the moment, I think there was just this trauma response of shutting down and compartmentalizing and realizing that I can only make a decision right now. I can't make a decision for tomorrow. I can't make a decision for next week. So it doesn't really matter what anybody else says or thinks. Even my husband was like, ultimately, this is you. This is your body. This is going on inside of you. You have to make this decision. So every time I'm going into those rooms, and I was alone because it was during COVID, so
yeah,
he couldn't even come with me to hold my hand during that time. I went into those rooms knowing that I had to decide that day, and I had to decide by myself. So it wasn't that hard to tune out the noise because it was a survival instinct, knowing
Yeah.
that everybody's going to have so many opinions, and people are going to say, you have to do this because God said that, or they'll say, you have to do this because you have to put yourself first. And I just couldn't afford to think like that in the moment. So in the moment, it was just, I have to shut down everything, and I just have to focus on what's right in front of me in this office, in this room, in this moment right now, and not think about anything else. And as time has gone on and my story has become a talking point in some places, I've handled it better sometimes and worse other times. I've sent some angry emails to certain outlets and
Yeah.
had them take down posts and things like that. But mostly, I just realized that I can't control what other people make out of my story.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of it all, the first time I shared it on social media, I prayed that God would let me keep it mine and that I wouldn't have to fight for the story to be mine. I didn't want it to become bigger than me. And I feel like he's honored that request. I haven't had too much of people politicizing it, more than I'm comfortable with, but probably not as much as other people
Yeah.
have dealt with. But yeah, I just sort of shut it down. I just shut the voices down and trust myself and trust that God has given me wisdom to navigate this. Even if I didn't have anybody to talk to ever, I would still be able to make these decisions with him, by myself, whatever it is. And so the noise just doesn't bother me like it did a few years ago.
Yeah. I love how in the book and in this conversation, you really talk about your understanding of God and your relationship, your faith relationship. Um,
Mhm.
and there's a significant part of your story that is a crisis of faith, a straight up crisis of faith. I think that's a pretty easy thing to define
Yeah.
it as, right? I'm curious. I feel like obviously there are so many people out there right now and in a new and emerging way that are experiencing very real doubt and very real
Hmm.
moments of deep faith
Yeah.
crisis. Um, did you write this book, or is some of your work, because I know you've written other things as well,
Mhm.
is this speaking directly to that moment? Do you hear all those voices out there? Do you see all those people out there who are just so lost in
Yeah.
what they used to think their faith was? It was so clear, and then it
Hmm.
became so fuzzy and sometimes so
Yeah.
dark. I'm curious about maybe your intentions in writing this and speaking to that experience out there.
Yeah, I wrote this with those people in mind and with myself years ago in mind, and
Mm.
the kind of book that maybe would have helped my faith crisis not be as devastating as it was. Because I feel like there's just these really extreme ways of talking about faith and talking about deconstruction and faith shifts, theologies changing. And I know a lot of people probably felt like I felt that if you don't have the faith of your childhood or the faith that you had when you first became a Christian, then you can't have faith at all. It's this all or nothing. This everything is orthodox or nothing is orthodox. And you
Yeah.
have these really extreme ways of talking about it. And I found in my own journey that I can still have faith, even if it doesn't look like what I thought it would look like at this point in my life, or it doesn't look anything like it was 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. And I think um, I just want people to know that it's really normal to question and doubt. It's part of the cycle of faith. There are many authors who have written books about the cycle of faith that helped me a lot, to realize that this was just normal. This was, everybody
Yeah.
goes through this sort of doubt experience, and that you'll get through it and you don't have to panic. Whatever it means for you, whatever getting through it means, and however your faith looks like on the other side of it, you don't have to panic. And panicking actually makes it last a whole lot longer.
Mm.
So the book, I was am hoping that the book is something that people can read. And even if they can't connect to everything that I'm talking about when it comes to faith, that they can see themselves in the questions and the doubts and I'm just hoping at least a little bit of this is true, because I could really use some hope in this dark season that I'm in.
Yeah, that even just that little comment. I'm just hoping that even just a little bit of this is true. Boy,
Yeah.
that is That's faith right there. That might be the definition of faith. And a lot of people think that's not enough. And I think that's such a
Yeah.
big point that your book makes is that no, that's plenty. Like it's no, you don't
Yeah.
you don't have to you don't have to be 100% convinced that this prayer is going to make it to the right ear at the right time. Like just even if maybe it is just a little bit,
Yeah.
you can hang on to that. And that's a powerful thing to hang on to.
Yeah.
I love the way that you said it earlier, and I had written down the way that you summed up your formulaic faith in the past. You said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. This is straight from the book. Accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Plus, don't sin that much. Plus, tithe 10% plus or equals a happy life of minimal suffering. and
Yeah.
and it doesn't add up that way for anybody ever.
No.
And all of us will experience some real trauma at some point in our life,
Mhm.
some real loss, some real pain, and yet we just keep trying to fool ourselves that our math equation, our us plus Jesus equals easy math equation is going to add up. But that's not how it is it? I mean that's
No.
is there do you have any other words of wisdom to just remind people it's okay if it doesn't add up?
Yeah, I mean the formula, when that formula breaks, it is devastating when you
Mm,
realize that the math ain't adding up, and
mm,
that means your world is not what you thought your world was. And I think I use the analogy or the metaphor in the book that it's like waking up in a room you've never been in before with no lights on, and you don't even have the flashlight on your phone.
yeah.
The entire world around you is unrecognizable when that formula breaks and God isn't who you believed him to be with all of your heart. I think that's another thing that people misunderstand about your faith going through this thing. People look in and say, well, she could have never been really a Christian anyway. She must have never really believed. But you can have deep, sincere faith one day, and then you go through something really hard, and the next you don't know what you believe in anymore. It can be that quick and that
Yeah.
traumatic when your faith formula breaks. And I think it's really helpful to know that lots of people have gone through that before, and it's nothing wrong with you. It's not because you just have the innate desire to sin and walk away from God, and you just have these theologies that you really want to believe. So you're trying to do whatever you can to make it work into your, it's not, it's usually not that sinister. It's just something that happens and you have no control over it. I think the
Mm,
best thing that you can do is accept what's happening and lean into it and really engage with it. Don't try to deny yourself the questions or shut them down because you're afraid of what will happen. I don't believe in the slippery slope. I know that's a thing a lot of Christians will say, or don't start asking questions, you'll go down the slippery slope.
yeah.
Well, maybe it'll be a fun ride. I don't know, but I don't really think the slippery slope is something we need to be afraid of. I think, if anything, we need to engage deeper and step closer to our doubts and our questions and see what happens when that
Yeah.
formula is not in your life anymore. It's been a really beautiful thing for me.
Yeah. I don't know why the image of a slippery slope struck me as you just described that. Like maybe it's a fun water slide. You know what?
Yeah,
And
let's go.
yeah, we fall into a big pool. It's a new baptism into a new way of
Yeah,
understanding faith. I'm gonna
it could
borrow
be
that.
fun.
I like that. It could be fun. It could be fun. You also talk in the book about how when our decision-making framework, you use that phrase,
Mm,
I think, or that concept, when our
yeah.
decision-making framework falls apart. So if we've got a formulaic faith-based decision-making framework and it
Hmm.
falls apart, and we're in this traumatic moment of our life, and both of those things are happening, like these are the
Hmm.
layers and layers and layers that your book just keeps sort of painting and reminding us how fragile we can be in
Yeah.
those moments. I think I wanted to ask you, how do you rebuild a decision-making
Mm,
framework after those moments that it felt like it was all just pieces on the floor?
yeah. Well, I don't know if there's like a universal way of rebuilding, but for my husband and I, after we left our church, and then when we went through when I witnessed the murder and we had to leave our house, and it was it was really complicated to figure that all out because it was gang related. So those things are never isolated. It can happen again. We were living in my father-in-law's apartment. There was just so many things that were
Mm,
making it really hard to decide what the right thing was to do. And then at the same time, we're fighting with this idea that God called us to this house and this is what we were supposed to be doing. But we had left our church the year before and we're in the middle of this faith crisis where we don't really know how to listen to God anymore. We don't the all of the things that we would have done a year ago to make a decision, those were completely gone and we hadn't had time to rebuild what the decision making framework would be because we didn't have to think about it. We were just in survival mode. And then I saw someone get killed and now we have to make these really big decisions for our family and our lives and our paradigms for ministry and all these other things that are going on. And so we at that time just threw a fortress over our family, shut out all the voices, all the noise, like what we were talking about earlier. We just shut it all out and stopped listening to other people and just said, we can trust ourselves. Even if
Mm.
God doesn't speak, we don't even know what that means right now for God to speak to us. Even if He doesn't write it in the clouds or we don't flip open our Bible and find some wisdom verse that tells us exactly what we need in the moment, which that's showing my charismatic upbringing. There's like,
Yeah.
my book of magic. I just open it up and God tells me what to do.
Uh,
Even if none of that happens, we are wise enough to make a decision for our family. So at that point, we just shut everybody out and we said we can trust ourselves and we can take the advice of the police and we can take the advice of people who have different perspectives of what it's like to live in a neighborhood like this. We can trust that we have the ability to make the decision that's right for our family. And we can trust that on the other side of it, we'll probably be okay, even if we make the wrong decision.
mm.
And so after having gone through something like that and making that decision and it all kind of falling into place and realizing just to keep a couple weeks later, I wrote in the book that 2 weeks later, the day that we moved out, there was another shooting on our front step.
Yeah.
So that was kind of this instant gratification of we made the right call.
Yeah.
That kind of helped build our confidence that we are capable of making decisions without mentors, without pastors, without having to pray and fast about it for weeks because we didn't have the luxury of taking a long time to make the decision. We had to make the decision pretty quickly. So glad that we did. So I think when your decision making framework completely breaks like that, you have to learn how to trust yourself
Mm.
first and build on the other stuff later, which is really hard if you're used to just saying, I'll just trust God, trust that God's going to tell me what to do when you're not sure what you believe about God anymore and you don't trust the people who speak for him anymore. You can trust yourself and trust that you have the wisdom and the ability to make a decision for yourself or for your family or for your marriage, whatever it is, and don't panic that every decision that you make is going to make or break your life. Most decisions are just it could probably go either way and you're probably going to be okay even if it's not the best decision in the world, and removing that pressure of I have to get it all right all the time. I have to get it right spiritually, I have to get it right practically, I have to get it right logistically. It's so much pressure. Just have to learn how to trust yourself. I don't know if that that answers the
Oh, it
question, but that was
does.
what was true for me.
No, I think it does so much. I think that you saying you have to learn to trust yourself. To some people listening, that might be like the most obvious advice in the world. But I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of people listening who grew up in a way or came up in a way, especially within their faith community or the spiritual environment
Hmm.
that surrounded them, where they were told not to trust themselves and
Yeah.
in literal and direct and very clear way. No, do not
Yep.
trust yourself. The self is all wrong. It's all sin. And
Yep.
boy, when you find yourself suddenly not trusting that the one thing you were told to follow, or the one thing you're told to follow doesn't show up anymore, right? Like
Yeah.
there's no more answers.
Yep.
Oh, how lost people must feel when
Yeah.
they don't trust themselves. And so to hear you and to know your story and to have read what the beautiful words that you put in this book, to just say the first thing we had to do was just learn to trust ourselves. That
Mm.
is a healing balm, I think, for a lot of people. That
Mm.
is
I
so,
hope
so
so.
important. So there's a line late in the book that struck me, and it's probably not a line that you wrote and you thought people would quote, in a podcast interview,
Mhm.
but it read like this. It says, "Once our lives slowed down, my body and my mind allowed me the space to actually feel what we'd gone through. I had to process all the stages of grief, even though from the outside, it didn't seem like I had anything to grieve.
Hmm.
because, right, because your girls were there and you had your daughters and everything,
Hmm.
happy ending. Everything had a happy ending,
Hmm.
right? So it didn't seem like there was but there was so much is how you ended that line. That resonated with me so deeply. I think I've got stuff in my past that I know has left these deep scars and has changed the way that I see and experience the world.
Hmm.
But I often don't feel like it deserves the title of trauma, or it deserves
Yeah.
me to even talk to other people about it or to try to heal from it, right? And
Hmm.
I don't get that about me, except that I know it's so common in other people that maybe it gives
Hmm.
me some solace. Like, why do people
Yeah.
feel like they don't deserve to grieve? Why do we feel like
Mm.
our pain and trauma aren't bad enough?
Yeah. I think it's probably really complex for each person, but I think a lot of it goes back to this idea that we have that the biggest traumas, the biggest suffering, these grand stories of these horrible things that have happened in people's life. We put those people on a pedestal. I'm not sure how you grew up, but I grew up hearing these people speak on stages and talk about these horrible things that they went through and then how God made it all okay. And it's these victorious things. And you're like, how can this person who went through this horrible, horrible thing stand on that stage and call God good?
Mm,
And you're like, how could I ever say that God isn't good when I haven't been through anything bad like that? And
right.
I think we celebrate those kind of stories so much that when we go through something painful, we immediately disqualify ourselves because we're like, but it wasn't anything like that. It wasn't that bad. So we automatically are like, I just gotta praise God that
Yeah.
that's what I went through and not, I didn't go through that. It's comparison. It's maybe even not wanting to admit how much something has
Mm,
affected us. We're afraid to look at our pain sometimes and say, yeah, this really hurts, either because it's too hard to process that pain or because we feel guilty for having it in the first place. But the worst thing you've ever been through is the worst thing that you've ever been through. And it doesn't really matter how it compares to anyone else, because I'm sure every story that you've ever heard of some big traumatic thing, before they went through that traumatic thing, they had something that wasn't that traumatic that
yeah.
still felt really, really maximum painful to them. I know the phrase "it's all relative" is probably a little overdone at this point, but I think there's truth to that and these kind of things, that your pain is your pain, and when you try to disqualify it or quantify it or make it so you have to prove that you deserve to feel the way that you feel, you just make your healing process a lot harder.
Yeah. And that's not even to mention I mean, the way that we're sort of societally trained to respond to each other's trauma and pain, which is to say, well, yeah, but look around you. You've got a loving
Yeah.
family, and oh yeah, but things could
Yeah.
be so much worse. And well, I'm just so glad that at least you still
Yep.
got your job, or whatever the
Mhm.
silver lining that somebody can point to. And this is well intentioned. This is how we're trained to
Yeah.
care for each other, and it's not actually a very good way to care for each other most of the time.
Mm-mm. No.
There's such Your book is well, it's about suffering.
Mhm.
It is about suffering, which is a hard thing to say, and a hard thing to know that's the heart and soul of what you wrote about. But
Yeah.
suffering and Christianity have an odd relationship, I think, in the minds of a
Yes.
lot of people. I think I know your answer because I've read your book, but maybe I'll prompt you this way so that you can offer it to anybody who's listening. Is suffering a requirement of a good Christian in your mind?
Not at all. Not even a little bit. Spoiler
Yeah,
alert if you haven't read the book
you're
yet.
right. Uh, and so much of Christianity is framed that way, though, isn't it? Is that
So much.
suffer
Yeah.
for Jesus? Jesus is
Yep.
suffered for you, so you ought to suffer for Jesus. I mean,
Yep.
that's the way it's
Suffer
set up.
for, suffer with,
Mhm,
just suffer. Suffer, suffer, suffer.
mhm, mhm. Is there a Does that mean if Christianity isn't about suffering,
Hmm.
is it the opposite? Is it for you? Is it ever the opposite? Is it the hope on the other side of suffering?
Yeah, I think it's hope on the other side of it and hope in it. I
Mm,
think the beautiful thing about the cross and what we've believe about the cross, what we read in scripture about the cross, isn't that he is going to take suffering away someday and that it's going to be okay someday, but that he's present with us in the suffering and he's good in it and there's hope in it, not just that one day we're going to be happy and everything will be fine. I think that's a really privileged way of thinking about life, is that one day this is going to be fine, maybe for you, but for some people it will be suffering until they die. And then what? Now we're just waiting for Jesus to bring us to some utopia that
Yeah.
everything's going to be fine. I don't believe that. I think that that we can be okay even when things are really, really dark, and we can have hope even in the most painful things that we've ever gone through. I think that's the beautiful thing, most beautiful thing about the Christian faith, is that we can dance while we're mourning, and we can have joy when we're mourning, and it not be something that is dismissing our pain or trying to usurp it, or I can't be sad because God's so good, so we're just going to dance. But we dance with our pain because we know that we can have hope in it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this was when I was reading your book, or it was when I was having another conversation with another guest on this podcast. To be honest with you, I've had a lot of those this weekend. I was finishing reading your book this week in preparation for this conversation. And it's Holy Week right now while we're
Yeah.
recording. It's Easter is this upcoming weekend, and I'm so struck by, I think, maybe rediscovering the message of the symbol of the cross, in that the symbol of
Hmm.
the cross is this intersection of heaven and earth, and or even what those mean symbolically. It's this
Hmm.
intersection of pain and healing. It's this intersection of worldly problems and heavenly answers. And the cross isn't actually the symbol. The ultimate symbol of Christianity is Jesus on the cross at the intersection, always there in
Hmm.
the middle of it, right?
Yeah.
That's if you're wondering what a Christian life looks like, it probably looks like what happens in the middle of all of that stuff when it all hits each other, and it's really
Hmm.
hard and it's really beautiful, and it's really a symbol that we somehow hang on our churches and say
Hmm.
this is what we're supposed to look at up here, because there's
Yeah.
a lot of messages behind that. I don't know why I went on that little rant, but maybe you just inspired me that direction. I appreciate it. There's a little anecdote in the book about how on the day after your world-shattering 20-week ultrasound, this was when you were essentially said you've got to decide if you're going to keep both babies or not.
Yeah.
Um, the anecdote you share is you took this long drive, I think, and you turned up the
Hmm.
music in the car and you were trying to process what was happening. And then you wrote this. I'll read from the book. The words, "What if he doesn't?" were bouncing around the walls of my head, and my ears were ringing. I needed to speak. I pulled over at a rest area in Vermont, set my phone on my steering wheel, and spoke to my Instagram following for the first time since the doctor's appointment. It felt sacred. I don't know. Our show is all about the sacredness of human connection.
Mm.
You've got like 40,000, I don't know, you got tens and tens of thousands of followers on Instagram and probably on other social media platforms. In part, I'm guessing, due to the fact that you understand that a social media connection can be sacred. I mean, you said it right there in the book. I, I'm curious. As somebody who's actively uh, on social media, and I mean, you'll just record a real raw video, unscripted stuff. You'll just share real stuff. Do those social media interactions really do they feel sacred to you? Do you feel like there is, I don't know, can God be found in the ones and zeros between you and the people connecting with you on social media?
For sure. I mean, not every not every single connection feels sacred. Some of
Yeah.
them feel like the opposite, whatever the
Uh-huh.
opposite of sacred is.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But yeah, I feel like human connection is sacred more often than it's not, especially when the connection that's happening is over humanity. I think
Mm.
so much in Christianity, we try to bypass our humanity. We pretend that things don't affect us. We just try to get past the human responses that we have to really real, heavy, or even not so heavy things. And when you can connect with people over human things happening in your life, I think that it's beautiful. And I think it's a beautiful reflection of the bride of Christ. I don't know that the people who wrote the Bible were ever factoring in social media being a part of the church. But I think that the church is the church wherever it is. And sometimes those human connections that feel sacred are between people who believe really, really different things about Jesus and really different things about scripture. And there's just this commonality between us that is, I see your pain and I see something of myself in what you're going through, whether it's heavy or light or whatever it is. I think it's beautiful.
Hmm.
No, I want to say every time, but it's not it's not every time, but
Yeah.
it's still really human every time. Maybe not sacred, but still a human connection that is important to us.
Yeah. The church is wherever it is. And I think, I think there are probably a lot of people who find it in the stories that you share on social media and that a lot of other people share on social
Mhm.
media. There is this, this is, I'm sure there are a lot of traditionalists who would argue otherwise and who would suggest, many things in the
Sure.
opposite vein. And
Yeah.
actually, I respect that. I get that. But man, the more time I spend on social media, a, I think I should spend less time on social media. But the more time I spend on social media, the more human it actually looks. The more even some
Yeah.
of those nasty, like broken comments, I'm
Mhm.
starting to be able to see through them to the people on the
Yeah.
other side and wonder what's hurting them so much that they wanted to say that at that moment, right? And that's a super hard
Mhm.
thing to do when it's directed to me. It's a lot easier when it's directed to somebody else. But uh, anyway, I agree, and I think I really do think those interactions can be sacred, and I think you're when you choose to take, to be very personally invested in sharing your very personal story, what a gift that is to show your humanness to others so that they might know that they're not alone. What could be more sacred than that?
Yeah.
What do you hope this book, even if he doesn't, what do you hope it does for people?
Mm. And I just hope people feel seen in it. I feel like the book, in a lot of ways, if you want to make it really simple, what the book does is it just bears witness to your pain. It doesn't offer solutions, really. It doesn't tell you why we suffer. It doesn't answer any of the great questions of suffering that Christians have been asking since the beginning of time. Like, how can a good God let these bad things happen? I didn't try to answer any of that because I don't think there are answers to those questions, but I hope that people feel like they have somebody who understands them and understands what they're going through. I hope that it normalizes it a little bit for them, makes them feel a little less panicked about what's happening internally. And on the other side, I hope that for the people who haven't gone through really traumatic things or things that have made them question their faith, that it'll give them empathy and understanding and compassion for the people whose lives have been devastated, their faith has been devastated by something that's happened or something that has happened to somebody that they love that's caused them to question what they believe. I hope that it will give people the wisdom and the understanding to care for themselves and care for each other.
Yeah. The idea of the book just bearing witness to pain. I think this is like a marketing tagline or something about the book on your website or on your publisher's website or something, but it's something like uh, no platitudes, just presence or something like that.
Yeah. Yep.
That idea, like I saw that line and I was like, that should just be advice for like the number one piece of advice. We should hand out little cards to people when they
Yeah.
say, "Oh, somebody in my life is going through something hard." Just hand them that card and say, "No platitudes, just presence." Like
I love
th-
that. It's a
that's
good
good
idea.
advice. So one last thing. I I'll be honest, I rarely read like the acknowledgement sections in the back of people's books. I typically figure those are actually just written for the people whose names are listed in the acknowledgments. But unless, I just can't get enough of this author's writing, and I just maybe this next page has another little nugget for me. And sure enough, I turn into your acknowledgments because I loved what I had been reading. And you wrote you wrote about this sweet little interaction you had with your grandfather in a
Mhm.
sermon that he had written that he titled "To What Purpose Is This Waste?" To what
Mhm.
purpose is this waste was the title of this sermon I think that he handed you. Is it okay if I ask you to share that story? Because I just really loved that story, and I thought it was a really cool callback to the way your book ended too. I really, it was what a smart little acknowledgement.
Well, first of all, thank you for reading the acknowledgments. I appreciate that. So my grandfather was a Southern, just about as Southern as you can get preacher. That was his whole life. He started preaching, I think, when he was 18 years old. So that was as much a part of his personality as anything else. And he was also someone in my life who would always call me out on stuff. I always say he educed things from me. He could see things in me that I couldn't see myself, and he would call them out in a really, grandfather kind of way. And I had just had my third baby when I went to visit him, and while we were sitting on his porch, he asked me why I wasn't writing anymore. That's something that I had always done, and I just kind of was like, "Ah, Papa, I've got kids now. It's just not, I can't do that." And he called me out on that, and he went inside and he got I think it was 3 pages front and back of a sermon that he had preached called "To What Purpose Is This Waste," which is based on the story in the New Testament of the woman who came and poured oil and washed Jesus' feet with oil. And the disciples said, "That's so expensive. Think of all the things that we could have done if we had sold that oil. To what purpose is this waste?" And all he said was, "I think you can do something with this." And that was 9 years ago now. And I've always thought about that and gone back to that. And after he gave me that sermon, I started writing again and building my blog and writing ebooks and things like that. I wasn't really thinking traditional publishing. I had kind of shut that dream down until after we went through what we went through with the girls. And I thought, you know what? I think it's time that I do something with this waste. And that's what the book is. It's all these stories of things that other people might look and say, what was the purpose of all that? And I've turned this into a book now. And I don't know what the purpose of the waste of my life is, but I know that it isn't wasted. And yeah, so Papa kind of just pushed me a little bit, and that led to the book becoming what it is, becoming a thing at all.
That's both a wonderful encapsulation of the heart and soul of the book, and the story that you've told, and it's also just a perfect demonstration of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about sacred moments of human connection. Like that little, I'm going to hand you this. Your grandpa handed you this sermon and saying, I bet you could do something with this. And later on, you turning it into this incredibly important book, this incredibly important work, or at least I know that that phrase and that story shows up at the end of the book, and I appreciate that so much. Kristen, where should people find you on the internet if they are, as I'm sure they are, eager to buy your book and follow you on Instagram and that kind of stuff? Where are the best places to find you right now?
Instagram is probably the best place. It's just my name, Kristen.Lavalley. And then I have a Substack as well, a blog where I write pretty regularly.
Yeah. Kristen, this has been absolutely fantastic. Genuinely, I want to acknowledge again, like this is the stuff that you chose to write about is the hardest things that you've experienced in life, and you chose to write about them in a way that you would package them up in a neat little gift with a beautiful cover to hand to anybody who might be going through a moment of significant faith doubt, who might be going through a moment of significant personal trauma, personal crisis. And what a thing to do for the world. Kristen, I hope you understand how important that work is and how much we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks to all you betweeners out there for listening to this episode of the Between Podcast. Make sure you visit between.church on the internet to sign up for our mailing list. That's probably the most important thing, our email list. Make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. You can check out our 5-minute sermons, 5-ish minute sermons that we post every week. Follow us on social media. We got daily prayers. We got all sorts of other content. And join our community fully. We invite everyone. You are welcome here, no matter who you are or where you're from, no matter what you believe or even if you believe, no matter who you love or how you love, no matter what anybody else has ever told you about you. You are welcome and loved and celebrated here at Between. You know, my favorite church is the space between people. Now go with God's love and create the church between.